Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us here today. Our latest webinar is around ransomware and protecting your practice. I wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. First is we've got a number of people on the line with us here, so we've muted all the phone lines. We will be pausing towards the end to answer questions, so please just use the GoToWebinar control panel that you all should see, and as questions occur to you, please go ahead and just type them in. Like I said, we'll pause at the end and answer your questions. As always with our webinars, we're recording the session today, and all registrants will receive a copy of the presentation materials as well as the recording. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce our panelists. We have Ben Baucom. He's the Director of IT here at Medical Advantage Group, and really the #1 guy responsible for security strategy at our company, as well as giving a lot of insight and direction to our larger PO accounts and clients. Prior to joining us here, Ben was an executive at Blue Cross, IT executive at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. We also have Chad Anglone. Chad is our Director of Professional Services. He's the guy, or leads the team of EHR consultants spending most of their days actually inside of practices. The primary focus is around EHR systems, implementations, upgrades, rescues, depending on the practice. But in general, just spends a tremendous amount of time giving guidance and insight around leveraging technology at the practice level. I think Chad has any number of real-world examples of hacking issues, security issues, ransomware, etc. So, Chad and Ben, thanks for being here today. Here's a list of topics that we're going to cover in the next 30 to 40 minutes. Given all of the news around hacking and ransomware, we just wanted to catch everyone up on current events and create awareness. We'll talk a little bit about ransomware, the background and how things have evolved over time and just the current trend. Ransomware is certainly not unique to the healthcare industry. As we'll talk about in a minute, healthcare is a leading target, but we'll talk about trends around in terms of vertical industries. Ben will step us through sort of how a ransomware attack typically occurs, step by step, and then the heart of the discussion is really around what all you can be doing to protect yourself. So with that, why don't we go ahead and just get started. So I'm sure everyone has heard, right? Ransomware is everywhere in the news. There seems to be no end in sight. Whether it's another attack occurring or large amounts of ransomware fees being paid out, it seems like every day we're learning more and more about this. Most recently, we had the WannaCry attack, which I think this was about a month ago now. But this is still living on. I mean, just for fun, I looked at the headlines just this morning, and this is still in the news. There's a report that a Honda facility in Japan somewhere had to shut down operation as a result of this attack. And all the way in Australia, like traffic cameras or there's some other issue in Australia as a result of this attack. So this isn't going away anytime soon. Really, by any measure, this is increasing and growing. I don't think we need to discuss or debate or try to convince anyone that ransomware is here to stay, right? So why don't we just get into this and talk about this a little bit? So I'll put it to you guys. You know, in the good old days, there was this thing called hacking. and it was annoying and all that, but it seems like things have really changed. So, Ben and Chad, Ben, maybe you could start us off. When we look at hacking from a generation ago or a decade ago, what was that about? And now how's it different in what we're seeing with ransomware today?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think what it used to be for a lot of people was about new frontiers and new challenges, right? To see if they could do something, to see if they could get into something. Sometimes it was about making a name for themselves. Sometimes it was about, it was like graffiti, signing their name on a bridge, right? They're gonna take over somebody's website and maybe put a political message up or something to that effect. And people figured out that you can protect against those kinds of things, and people lose interest in that fairly quickly, right? It only lives so long. But now with ransomware, people have discovered they can actually make money from it, right? If to use my graffiti analogy, there's artists that now get paid to make graffiti, right? On buildings and things, it's artwork. Well, now they've found out that, well, people can make money by hacking other people's computers and systems and essentially extorting money from them in order to recover. So it's really turned into a fairly lucrative business model for some people, and it's how they essentially make a living. So now they've upped the ante, right? Where it's now people's lives that are at stake, right? It's people's well-being, and it's people trying to get rich off of that.
Very good. I mean, Chad, you had made a point about it. It's almost like credit card theft from yesterday. It's almost like this is today's version.
Right, I think it's a lot easier way, a lot more deployable on their side, where they're able to go out to a lot of small businesses that maybe don't have the protections in place and extort, between $300 and $600 at a time, instead of going through all the work to, grab credit card numbers and do everything you need to do to make a transaction.
Very good, very good. And the other thing I'll add is it sort of spawns this cottage industry, right? Where we're seeing all kinds of services available, where if you want to protect yourself, hey, just sign up with me with so much per month for the next year, and we'll help protect your business or your practice.
Yeah, and it's an escalation, right? So people sell protection against ransomware, and now there's ransomware authors that will sell ransomware to other people. So it's like an arms race where people just keep selling weapons and defense.
Okay, very good. So let's talk about where it's happening. We've got a couple of reports or some statistics. Here's one we found. This was actually, for those of you joining us from Indiana, there was a breakout session at the recent Indiana Rural Health Conference just 2 weeks ago. And this is covering breaches, so it's security breaches. It's not necessarily ransomware, but you can see over half have hit the healthcare industry. Another data point, this is just from NTT Security. They publish a annual report, Global Threats, and in terms of ransomware, if you look at the top 4 industries, healthcare is right up there with the other 3. Another thing I found was just the healthcare breach has become very interesting, newsworthy events. This is just a brief timeline of some recent ones, big ones, where you can see large insurance companies, payers are involved, hospital systems, healthcare systems. It becomes very, very, very juicy and newsworthy. So why don't we talk about this? I mean, why, from your guys' perspective, why is healthcare such an interesting target? Ben, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, I think it's really 2 things, right? When you talk about ransomware, it's about locking up your business so that people can extort money from you for the data that you have, right? And when you talk about healthcare data, there's no other more valuable or sensitive data, right? If your credit card's stolen, your bank and your credit card company can work with you to recover funds, and you can, with some inconvenience, you can get back to normal, right? But once your health data is stolen and it's out there and it's published for the world, it's out there and there's no taking that back, right? So people will pay more to protect that information or get access to it back from a ransomware extortion, right? So healthcare is a target because it's more valuable data, right? It's the most valuable data that they can have. And the second reason is that the healthcare industry has a wide range of technology involved, and it's been relatively it's relatively young in that it doesn't have a lot of strong practices in making sure it's up to date and patched and protected against this kind of thing. So, right, and depending on where you go from a small practice all the way to a hospital, they have very different ways of looking at IT and data and security. So what you have is a very valuable target, and you have multiple ways to get at that target, right? So there's a lot of holes in the dam that you could take advantage of when you're looking at going after someone in the healthcare industry.
And I think, Ben, just to add on top of that, I think it's also an industry where you are doing a lot of point of service with your patients. So you need access to that data right now. So like hospitals, practices, banks, police departments, airlines, all these different types of businesses where you need the information right now, and you may not be able to be down, 7 to 10 days to let your backups take effect. And a lot of these practices that I've seen or read up on are having to pay this ransom just to get access right now. So I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, is what we really recommend to do. But I think that's why healthcare is so highly impacted by this, is because you need your data in real time.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chad. Unlike if I'm a farmer and I'm going to go, work on my fields all afternoon with my crew, that's one thing. But I'm sure you and your team, you guys see this every day when you're out with practices, as our industry has shifted towards practice management systems and electronic health records and patient engagement capabilities through a portal, patient portals, etc. If any of that stuff is down or offline, it really becomes almost impossible for a practice to even operate. Okay, very good, very good. And I guess the other point we're making here is it's no longer just the giant hospital in town, right? That the small primary care or specialist practice, maybe not for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in ransomware. Maybe, as Chad, you just mentioned, might be just a couple $100, but the small practice is no longer immune either.
Right. I think a great example of that, Bill, I was at a practice not too long ago, just a couple years ago. They had an on-premise server, so they were hosting their own server. They had a family member doing IT. He was an IT professional, pretty knowledgeable, but it was more of a pay-as-you-go situation. So he would come into the practice when they had issues or if they needed something. Unfortunately, they became infected with ransomware through a malicious email, so something that one of the front office staff actually opened. It locked the computer. That computer had not only the EHR on it, but it had QuickBooks, which was their accounting software. And they ended up deciding as a practice to pay so that they could gain access to their stuff back. And things like that. There's a lot of different things that they may have done wrong there to make that happen, and they never knew about it. So I think, trying to get out and educate as many practices as we can, like we are today, on not only the dangers, but what you can do to prepare. That IT person, they were only coming in as a pay-as-you-go basis. So unfortunately, they weren't there to do the updates that needed to be done that may have not allowed that malicious email to take effect within their computers. So, I think that's a good example of it was a one-doc practice, which many of our practices are, and you're not going to be able to afford a full-time IT person on staff. So I think there are some things that you can do to, protect yourself.
Very good, very good. So why don't we talk about, without getting into all the remedies yet, we'll get into that a little bit later. But just from an IT or a technology perspective, Ben, maybe you can talk us through, get us started, just understanding, what are the areas of entry or the vulnerabilities that a practice might have.
Right. And overwhelmingly, the vulnerabilities are on older software, right? So if you have Windows XP in your practice, right, that doesn't have current patches, right? So there's all kinds of software problems that have existed on that platform for years that that ransomware people are able to take advantage of effectively and quickly. It's super efficient for them to go after people that have very old software in that manner, right? So the more aging kind of software and hardware you have, the more that it's interconnected in your practice and networked together, the faster that ransomware spreads, right? To Chad's example, if you have a lot of PCs in your practice that run all of your business, right, then there's one target and that ransomware attacker owns your entire business, right? You're stuck, you can't do anything, right? There's different ways around that we'll get into soon, but I think that's kind of the overwhelming platform that you see those kinds of attacks on, right? There are instances where there's EHR software running in the cloud where ransomware attackers will go after the cloud providers, but it's much harder for them to go after, right? The practice really is the target because they're usually not patched, not current, or they might have specialized medical equipment in the practice where the vendor hasn't updated their things, right? They might say, oh, well, our equipment only works with Windows 7. You can't upgrade to Windows 10 yet, or you have to use this old piece of equipment and you can't get new stuff until next year, right? So you could have some equipment in your practice that's holding you back from being protected, right? And in those cases, you need to look at, well, then maybe that equipment shouldn't be connected with the computer with my billing software on it, to Chad's point.
Very good. And Chad, maybe you have some examples of, beyond just that. I'm sure there are any number of examples where the technology is old or out of date, but there's probably opportunity in terms of how we manage people in a practice or process, best practices around how to protect a practice that maybe you've seen over time.
Yeah, and I think Ben's exactly right. I mean, I hear it over and over that we can't upgrade to that version or we can't apply those patches to Windows because we can't access the hospital system through Internet Explorer. Or, I have a scanner an older scanner that I connect to my computer that I use for general scanning that isn't able to run on Windows 10 or maybe on some of the updates that have occurred. So we've actually went back to a previous version or we've stayed where we are. I also see practices very commonly bring in personal computers that, this person works from home occasionally. It would be nice if they could access the EHR from home. And unfortunately, those computers may not have the same level of protection as the computers within the practice. And a lot of people, especially going to these more cloud-based applications where you're able to access through like a Google Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer, believe that everything's fully protected because it's password protected and there's nothing on the hard drive of the computer. But you really have to be careful because there's a lot of pieces of EHRs that do use maybe like a Microsoft Word for a letter, for example, that maybe you're writing a work excuse letter and you write it in Microsoft Word and you save it on in your documents within your computer to use later for another patient. We see that quite often, that when you do start looking into the C drive on a computer, you see that there is a lot of stuff saved out of the EHR. Another common one that I see is saving medical records to a PDF to then put on a thumb drive for a patient and even encrypt it. I mean, they're going far enough to even encrypt that for the patient, but then not realizing that to start with, they save that on their C drive before putting it onto the thumb drive. So you have to be very careful. And a lot of times I recommend if you are going to have staff access from home on their own home computers, that it's held to the same standards as the computers that you purchase for your office.
Yeah, Chad, that's a great point, and I just want to add, on top of people using their home stuff, right? There's no magic platform that's invulnerable, right? I talked about versions of Windows, and we talked about different browsers that you can use, right? That doesn't mean you should go out and buy a Mac or a Chrome PC or anything, right? From Google. None of those things are invulnerable. It's just different ways that everything's vulnerable. So it's really about making sure that you go through and make sure you're protected in your current and some of the other things that we'll talk about shortly. But it's every platform that's vulnerable.
All right, thanks, guys. So you know what? If I do get my systems taken over, no problem, right? I'm just going to go down the street and I'm going to get the police involved and everything will be just fine. Ben, maybe you could lead us off with some of the challenges. I'm kidding, of course, just around law enforcement of these kinds of things.
Yeah, and ransomware is one of the most underreported cyber crimes that there is, right? Especially in the healthcare industry, right? So when we have numbers that show these huge healthcare numbers of people that have been attacked, right? That's not everybody, right? Most people don't report either because they're scared because they think they're going to get in trouble with HIPAA, or they're embarrassed because something happened and they lost control, right? So usually it's not reported. A lot of people do pay, or they quote unquote start over, right? But the right thing to make sure you do is report it. Now, depending on where you are and the local law enforcement that you have, they may have to refer to you to a specialist, which sometimes is, some larger cities will have cybercrime units that they can work with to help you figure out what's going on, and other times you may even get referred to the local branch of the FBI, depending on where you are, right? And one of the reasons it's important to do that is not only for reporting and statistics, right? That's great. Everybody cares about that when they're not the ones impacted, right? But it's also to determine what kind of ransomware you're attacked with, right? Because you may or may not have a HIPAA breach. You may need some help figuring out, was my patient data impacted, or was it just my QuickBooks, or was it just my PC I used in the back to surf the web, right? It could be all different kinds of variants, and if you do report, then there are people that will help you figure out what to do next, right? So reporting helps you make decisions about how you resolve the issue. And then I think the reason people another reason people don't report is that they don't really believe the police can do anything about it, because usually the hacker's overseas, right, or in another country, or they might not be able to trace them, right? And that is very true. It's very hard to go after people who do this kind of thing. So it's really about recovery. It's not about pressing charges.
Very good. And as I think there's a great irony in that if you look for this, there are any number of examples where police departments themselves have been breached and by ransomware people, and any number of examples where police departments have paid the ransom, or in other cases have lost a bunch of information. Like there was one article I saw where years worth of digital evidence files had been deleted because the department chose to not pay the ransomware. Anyway. And I think the law enforcement challenge just adds to this whole scenario, right? So anyway, Ben, if you could take a minute and kind of step us through what a ransomware attack might actually look like. I know that there's going to be some variability and things might be different, but generally speaking, how do these guys, if I'm a practice here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, how are these guys finding me and targeting me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's good to point out that this happens very much like any other breach, right? So your slide earlier that showed 55% of breaches are in the medical industry apply to this because it comes in the same way, whether they're going to hold you for ransom or whether they're just trying to break into your system and steal data. It's the exact same way. So usually there's some kind of exploit, and when we say exploit, we mean there's some kind of vulnerability in the system that you're using that's a bug, right? And they're going to take advantage of that bug to take control of your system. And that can come in through an email. Maybe that email has a Word attachment with a macro in it, or an Excel attachment with a macro, right? Those are pretty common ways, right? You can send a lot of emails for cheap, and people just generally open them, right? Not a lot of people can tell the difference between a bad email and a good one, right? We have seen instances where people were hit with ransomware just by viewing a web page, right? So if a browser has a vulnerability like Internet Explorer, you may go to a website, and that website may have been hacked last week, and it's putting out ransomware to every visitor that comes to the website. And even more scary is when that website wasn't hacked, but the ad network that serves ads on that website was, right? So you might go to a website and you see an ad for a product, and you get some ransomware through your browser like that, right? So those are very common ways that can happen. Other ways that spread much slower than those are using USB keys that come from unknown sources, right? If a patient comes in and says, here's my health record, right? You plug it into your machine. Well, if that other practice was infected or their PC at home was infected, well, yours is now too, right? So those ways don't, those types of methods don't move as fast because they're physical. They require, people to exchange physical things. But email, websites are generally the biggest. In addition, the third entry point is usually around networking, right? If you don't have good firewalls, or there's a hole that you don't understand in your firewall, right, then someone will try and connect to your computer directly and will infect it like that. And that's how the WannaCry virus that was going around or ransomware that was going around last month spread, was through issues on network protections with Windows PCs. So it was able to spread fairly quickly because it didn't have to wait for emails to send or for people to exchange thumb drives or other media. So that's kind of how you get it, right? Once you get it, your computer starts talking back to what's called a command and control server, right? So this is basically your computer's talking back to the hacker, and it's telling the hacker that it's got control of your system, and it's encrypting your files, and it's giving the keys to open those things back to the person who's going to exploit you, right, or hold you for ransom. Once those files are all locked up, then that attacker has the only copy of the key, right? Generally, what they do at that point is start a timer, right? Because they want to pressure you into paying. So they're going to hold control of your computer. They're going to try and infect other computers around you and your network, in your company, in your practice, right? And while they try and spread more, they're going to up, every time they get more, they're going to up the price or lower the time, right? To try and get you to pay faster, right? Because they need to move on to the next one, and they need to get out of your practice so that there's less chance of them being caught, right? So they're going to try and pressure you very hard to pay at that point. But at the same time, they're using your system to try and spread more ransomware for their next target.
Okay. Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. Now, many times when a ransom demand is made, we quickly hear about Bitcoin. So I thought maybe we could take a moment and just talk about what is Bitcoin and why is this so common in these ransomware scenarios.
Yeah, so Bitcoin is a new, it's relatively new kind of digital currency. It was developed several years ago as a way to conduct financial transactions without countries involved, right? So it's not based on U.S. dollars or any other kind of British pounds or anything like that. Mm-hmm. It was developed from scratch, and there's a finite amount of them that it's possible. So there's a it's like gold. There's only so much in the world, so these things have value, right? And the unique thing about that is that it's more like cash than it is like credit. So that's why it's really popular in the ransomware community, because if you give someone cash, once it's gone, it's gone. There's no way to pull it back,
Trace.
and there's no way to know where it's going next, right? So it's untraceable, so that these folks can't get caught, right? If you've seen any movies where people steal money out of bank accounts, right? They always try and move it into like a Swiss bank account so nobody can find it later, and they move it all over the Bahamas or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Bitcoin has all of those properties, but they don't have to go through those crazy steps. It's just immediately transferred. Your money is gone. They're gone with it, and there's no way to find them again.
Very good. Now it was poking around, there are legitimate uses of Bitcoin. Like I saw, I think Dell supports Bitcoin as a currency when you're buying machines from them. There are different airlines that you can buy tickets.
Yep.
It's not just for ransomware scenarios.
Yeah, it's a very legitimate currency. It's used in a lot of exchanges. A lot of businesses accept it. And some people really do like the privacy of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a reason we still use cash in our
Mm-hmm.
society, right? People still like to be able to pay for things and not worry about people looking over their shoulder at what they're buying, or that people at Kroger are watching what foods they're buying, right?
Yeah.
So Bitcoin is the digital equivalent of cash.
Yeah. The one easy example I saw was people doing a lot of online gambling don't necessarily want, just as you say, people know how much time and money they're spending online gambling. So Bitcoin is very popular there as well. And then as you can see from the photo there, different ways, how do you get Bitcoin? And an interesting thing was these kiosks are popping up all over the place where you don't get anything physical in return, right? But you're inputting, in many cases, cash, $20 bills, in some cases a lot of them, right? And then you get notification on your smartphone or whatever regarding the transaction. All right, so let's talk about scenarios. I tried to lay out best case, worst case, just to get us going here. But Ben, maybe you can start us. My systems have been taken over, and I decide I'm going to pay or not. What could happen next?
Yeah, and deciding if you're going to pay or not is really a personal decision about you and your business. We don't really give any advice there about whether you want to or not. But if you do decide to pay, the best case scenario that can happen is that you're working with a ransomware author who's, I'm going to say, a good business person, right? They want you to pay, and they're gonna make it easy for you to pay, and they're gonna give you exactly what you expect when you pay, right? So you hand them the money, right, and they unlock your machines, and you go back to exactly how you were the day before you were hit with ransomware, right? Where you get your systems back relatively untouched, right? Everything is just back to normal, right? And in those scenarios, those people really are, like I said, business people trying to make a quick buck, right, with a little exploit on the side, right, where they're trying to make some money fast. They're trying to get people to pay, and they want to encourage you to pay. So they're gonna do I guess I'm gonna call it the right thing as best that I can, and make sure that you're back in business, so that the next time they come back, you'll pay again, right? They want to train you to keep paying, right? And they're going to keep coming back with new exploits. And just because you're hit with it and you pay and you get unencrypted and you get your stuff back doesn't mean you're immune, right? It's not like getting it's not like getting the chicken pox where you're going to get it once and then you're done. You can get it every day, right? They can keep coming back, right? So that kind of leads into the worst cases, right, where they can come back and hold you ransom again. But sometimes you find people who are less business-like and more about causing problems, right? This leads back to what we called like the old hackers who want to prove they can do something, or they want to be destructive, or they don't really want to go through the effort of training you to pay again because they're in a short-term game, right? So a lot of times folks will pay, and then the ransomware author will just disappear. They won't do anything about it, or maybe the software they use to encrypt your machine can't be unencrypted, They might not be able to unencrypt it at all for you, right? So you're out the money, and you're out all your systems and data, and they run away, and you're still left holding the bag, so to say. And to make matters worse, there are some types of ransomware where as they encrypt your files, they copy them all, right? So this is another way for the attacker to exploit you or hold you for additional ransom, right? They could copy all of your patient records off of your computer, and then you're looking at potential HIPAA breaches, right? Where now your patient records have left your practice, they're out of your control, and you don't know where they went, right? They could be somewhere in Asia or Russia being sold on the black market to identity thieves. Sometimes they get published online on underground websites for just because people can, right? And those are all HIPAA breaches. So that's why it's important, as I said earlier, to report and figure out what kind of ransomware you have, so you can figure excuse me, you can figure out if you pay, are you going to get your files back, and are you already in a HIPAA breach or HIPAA compliance issue where you need to do additional reporting.
So Chad, you were saying when we were gathering earlier that you had a recent example of this, right?
Yeah, so my son had gone to a local practice that had been hit with ransomware. We actually received a letter. Both my wife, who was the guarantor, and my son, who was the patient, received a letter just over a week ago notifying of a data breach. So it was literally titled Notice of Data Breach. And in that letter, it went over what happened, what information was involved, what the practice is doing, what you can do as a patient. And then, unfortunately, it was one of the bad ones. So they explained in the letter that they did access and copy the PHI, as well as taking the computer hostage. So they notified all patients what was accessed, and alerted each patient and guarantor to alert your credit agency, and then start to run regular credit checks. So as you can imagine, that's a very difficult letter for a practice to send out, and very difficult for the patients to hear.
Okay, so why don't we'll start to wrap up here. Want to have you guys talk about what advice, what are best practices that we can share with our audience. Ben, do you want to start?
Sure, and I know we've got a good list here on the slide. I think there's really two classes of things you can do, right? First is your first line of defense is to protect your practice, right? Make sure that you are running current software, make sure that it's running regular patches, right? Most current systems will patch themselves if you just let them, right? You got to, you might want to have your IT folks make sure that your patch schedule is running correctly. But if you're running like Windows 10, it patches itself every Tuesday, and you get all the latest protection that Microsoft can offer you, right? And for example, we were talking about the WannaCry from last month. Microsoft has already released patches for that in Windows 10, and those are available now. So if you get those, you're less likely to get infected with that particular ransomware. So that's always like the first, build the wall around your practice. Make sure you're current, make sure you're patched, make sure you're protected. You have all the antivirus and anti-malware software loaded, and that all of that is current, right? You're not using a version from 5 years ago, right? And you also want to make sure that all of your systems are current in your practice, right? So if you're using anything from a vendor, right? We talked about specialized medical equipment earlier. Make sure that you have the latest versions of software from your vendors. Make sure that they are supporting you in running current versions of software, and make sure that those things are taken care of on a regular basis. It's kind of like maintenance work, right? Where you can't just set it and forget it. You do want to check it from time to time, fairly often. Make sure that it's still working right for you. And the second piece is really about recovery, right? It's make sure that you're able to recover from ransomware. And my advice is, assume that you're not going to get your files back even if you pay, right? What is the worst case scenario? So this really goes to business continuity planning. It goes to making sure you have good backups, right? I've seen folks in the past who Yeah, they back up all their software. They have this USB drive that's plugged into their computer, and they copy all their files over every day, and they're very methodical about it, and that's great. But if your USB drive is connected to your computer when it gets ransomware, your USB drive is going to be encrypted too, and those files are worthless to you. So you have to make sure you have good disconnected backups, right? Off-site is even better, right? And there's several solutions for making backups and taking them off-site, or using a cloud backup vendor if you so choose. But those are really the two things you can do: is make sure you've got a good security perimeter, good firewalls, you're patched, you're ready to go, and then make sure that you can recover just in case something happens that you couldn't plan for.
Very good. Chad, do you have any color or anything you'd like to add?
I think another thing that we need to look at is it goes beyond just your typical emails, as Ben talked about earlier. So an ad blocker is another thing that I've been recommending to a lot of the practices. If your staff is going to be utilizing the internet, a lot of very trusted sites have been hit. Ben talked about that earlier. New York Times was a big one. They weren't necessarily hit, but their ad agency was. So these pop-ups that would come up would be malicious, and we're infecting different trusted processes that these you might have looked up something on Google, and next thing you know, you're getting an ad for something similar that you trust coming off the New York Times website, and your computer's becoming infected. So I think investing in the technology that can at least help protect you, like Ben said, nothing's 100%, but at least building that barrier, as well as educating staff. So there are quite a few different training seminars you can attend on what to look for in emails, what to look for in websites, practices that you should be doing to protect yourself as a practice, not only with your technology but with your people.
Okay, very good. So we've had a number of questions come in. So why don't we take a look here. Let's see. The first is around patches. My IT says that our older machines are still being patched. Am I safe?
Yeah, and the question, or the answer, is probably not, right? If you're on Windows XP or Windows 7, right, Microsoft has stopped their normal patch cycle for those, right? They're not spending more money to try and protect those systems. They're investing all of their money in their newest systems in order to keep them the most secure. So they really are inviting everyone to get to current versions of software. So that means if you have a lot of machines in your practice running Windows 7 or XP, you probably should look into upgrading or replacing them depending on how old they are, right? And making sure that they're current and patched up. For example, Microsoft doesn't supply patches for Windows XP anymore. They have supplied 2 or 3 in the last few months because of ransomware only, but that's only when they have big giant things like the WannaCry hit from last month. They won't do it for the hundreds of thousands of ransomware attacks that happen every day. It's just not feasible for them to continue to do that. That's supporting, that's like trying to support a 20-year-old car. It gets really hard over time. So they don't do that. And I would say, you want to make sure that you look at other vendors that you have that specialized medical equipment on, and push them to support the newest versions of all that software as well, right? Don't let them hold you back, and continually push them to do their jobs to support the products that you've purchased from them, or you're looking at replacing, right, in order to be protected.
Okay, so just here's a follow-up question, and I think I know the answer, but specifically, is Windows 7 Professional new enough? I have Windows 10 on my other computers, but it sounds like they have some machines with Windows 7 Professional. Is that good enough to protect against ransomware? What would your advice be?
My personal advice is that it's not. Right, you should be looking into Windows 10 at this point and figuring out a plan to migrate. That doesn't mean you have to do it tomorrow, right? But it's how much coverage you can provide for yourself, right? It's a newer, better inoculation against a disease to have Windows 10 than Windows 7. When we talk about exploits, Windows 7 has been around long enough that many exploits exist now for it, right? And it's not changed. You know, Microsoft doesn't keep it up to date anymore. So there's going to be more discovered every day. So the longer you wait, the more at risk you are.
Very good. Okay, Chad, here's one I think more up your alley, and it's around vulnerabilities in EHR systems. I know that you and your team are typically working with huge, large-scale EHR vendor technology, which I presume has the security kind of baked in. But the question is just around, are there things that a practice should be looking at? Are there common vulnerabilities in the EHR tool itself, or just to paraphrase, are people breaking in, you know, other ways? Maybe, you know, looking at older versions of operating systems, like Ben mentioned.
Well, I think the big thing you need to look at is when you're deciding if you're going to host your server on premise, or you're going to go to the cloud. You know, a lot of EHR companies have hundreds of staff and millions of dollars to put towards their security and protecting those servers from being accessed, those databases from being accessed, and you're taking on a lot of that risk yourself by having an on-premise solution. I'm not saying that, you know, we would advise against that, and there's definitely reasons for having your own server on site, but you really are taking on a lot of responsibility to not only your business but your patients, to ensure that's protected. And secondly, I just want to kind of reiterate the fact that, like Ben said, there are a lot of different devices and computers connected. Whether it's a bone density machine with a computer. I've had practices in the past that said, you know, Chad, do you recommend I connect my bone density machine? The computer's Windows 2003, or I had a lab interface company as well where the computer they supplied in the office was XP, and they were unwilling to upgrade it. And you really want to have that discussion with your team internally to say, is it worth it to connect those devices or those interfaces if it's going to open up you know, a level of risk to your practice.
Very good, very good. Here's an interesting one. You mentioned cloud technology. Has Medical Advantage Group deployed cloud? Can I ask which platform you have chosen?
Yes, so to run our company, we use Microsoft Office 365, right? So that is a cloud-based platform. They support all of our email and document storage and things like that, right? And there's a lot of different plans that they have available with varying levels of protection that you can get from them. They do sign BAAs, so you're able to get protection with HIPAA, right? So that's a good place to start, right, with basic services like that. Right. Microsoft doesn't run any EHR platforms though, so you do have to look at, you know, what cloud-based platform you would want to use for your EHR for your practice. But for Office type of software and services, Microsoft 365 is a good place to start.
Okay, no additional questions. So as we start to wrap up, once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. I especially want to thank Ben and Chad for your expertise and insight. Well done, as always. Thanks to our audience members for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be following up with you shortly with a link to the recording of today's session along with the material. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me. My information is there on the screen. And I guess that's it for now. So thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.